rasp of frost greets him before any other sign. The air bites at the inside of Merlin's cloak, and a thin thread of smoke curls by like a thought escaping a ruined hearth. He steps out of a fold in time into a world that still smells of iron and rain, where the grass remembers footsteps and the sky holds a long, tired song. He has come to decide a fate, to lay a hand of judgment where years and wars have already set their marks, and already he feels the small, terrible tally of what such power will cost. The field is a bruise of churned earth and blackened stubs, the kind of place that keeps its wounds open for a long while. Iron flakes glint where metal splintered beneath hooves. A distant wood breathes steam. The trunks stand like a row of watchful men. When he moves, the light seems to measure him, as if the world itself queries his right to this hour. Merlin has walked through many ages and read the bones of kingdoms, but here the language of fate is braided with something stubborn, habit, choice, the clinging thread of mortal will. It resists being plucked. He reaches for magic as a walker reaches for a staff, because that is how he speaks to the shape of things. His power answers like a soft instrument, tuned to centuries of rhyme and rune. Then it balks, as if some other hand has laid a finger upon the strings. Threads that shimmer for him in other worlds are dull here. Bright strands break against faces and mouths, and the decisions made by small, obstinate beings. A rule that ruled elsewhere will not hold. His breath comes out in white, and he hears the quiet sound of a different law. Not absolute command, but persuasion that must be earned. From the gray seam of a hedgerow, a figure steps, and the light finds him small and longer-lived than the hedges would allow. He wears a coat the color of old smoke, and his hat is like a soft, forgotten hill. His beard is a thought of silver. He moves with a gait as deliberate as a slow river, and when he speaks, his voice has the warmth of an ember side. He calls himself a guardian of small things, and that appellation lands like a stone dropped upon still water. The ripples reach farther than might be guessed. Merlin studies him. There is no pomp, no crown of power, only a certainty that something worthwhile might hinge upon a carefully kept cup, a single locked door, the unglamorous courage of one small hearth. The gray figure's eyes are sharp, and when they dwell on Merlin, they do not ask for grand titles. They ask instead whether magic understands the value of a kettle kept warm or a promise honored in the rain. The two men measure one another as the clouds lean in. One scans the world as scaffold for wisdom. The other reads it as a weave of choices that will not be rearranged by the waving of a hand. You step where many would only peer, the gray one says. His words are modest, but they carry a weight that presses against Merlin's old certainty. You hold power to unmake, yet here power is a stubborn thing. It will not be imposed. Merlin replies with a soft, almost rueful smile. Nor would I impose if I could spare it. His hands are narrow, calloused by centuries of conjuring and counsel. I have seen empires undone by my counsel, and men redeemed by what I left unpicked. Still, I am to weigh a fate. I will know whether the shadow can be snuffed, or whether the courage that burned against it must be preserved. Rain comes then in a thin, pensive drizzle, as if the sky itself were undecided. The wind smells of old embers and of loam turned over, and the earth gives a faint, living complaint underfoot. In the air hangs the remnant hum of many small lives. A child's laugh echoes from a hollow hill. A dog barks once and stops. Distant forging hammers mark time. The gray man listens to those sounds as if to a chorus, then adds, "You think in ends. Here we think in keepings." That single phrase strikes Merlin. He has always been a maker of ends and beginnings, an architect of turning points. To imagine a world that treasures the keeping of things small feels as foreign as being offered a crown and told to keep feet warm. He looks to the hedgerow brigade of stars above, where the night is thin and a waning light pools like an old bruised coin. There, toward the west, something stirs a different kind of hunger in him, a thinness of thread, a filament he had expected to find woven thick. Merlin reaches, not with his practiced spells, but with the quiet of a question. He sends a finger of thought along the possible skeins and is met with a resistance unlike anything before. It is warm, like a hand within a glove. It is stubborn, like a promise kept through hunger. This is the weave of things that comes from living hands and the choices they make. It bends where kings might pull it taut, and yet it curls back when small folk choose contrary paths. The magic here is less a hammer than a conversation. Who keeps such a thread? Merlin asks. He feels levity under his ribs, an old scholar's thrill peering into a new grammar. The gray man smiles, slow and knowing. Many hands, he says, many small vows, mostly the weak and the faithful, the ones whom history forgets, but whose choices not a tapestry tight enough to hold. I watch the stitches. He taps his staff once against the ground. The sound is a pebble dropped in deep water. I am an unlikely guardian. I tend what is overlooked. In the hush that follows, Merlin hears something like a ring, soft, barely a whisper. Not the clink of metal, but the sound of a single promise wrapped in iron. He is drawn, as a bird is drawn to a warm spot in a field, to that thin filament. It runs under hedgerows, threads through the shadowed hollow of a hill, and lifts where a small hand has once chosen kindness over fear. Merlin is aware now of the ring itself as a presence, not merely a thing, a small, hard hunger that has collected echoes. The thread he eyes is not the ring, but a slender pathway of consequence that leads to it and away. How does a thing so small bind so much? Merlin wonders aloud. He watches the gray man's face in the rain. It need not be large, the guardian replies. A ring is round and takes up little room, but a circle claims what it touches. It seeks measure, and measure answers. Yet it cannot entirely alone decide. The living answer back. He points with his staff, and a gust lifts the scent of hearth and bread from a far unseen village. The gesture is simple, the signal is vast. Merlin considers the cost again. To reach for a fate here might be to erase the valor of those who bled for light. To refrain might let a shadow slip its chains and grow where once courage kept it narrow. He remembers fields like this from other ages, the low moans of men who misjudged ends and the terrible relief of a hard-won preservation. His old bones ache at the thought of changing the tally retrospectively. "You would not have me decide lightly," he says. "I must follow this thread, then. I must see where it tightens around a heart." His voice is steady, ironed by long habit. "If there is a strand by which the ring's fate may be glimpsed without unmaking the bravery that met it, I will find it." The gray man inclines his head. "You have the patience, old one. But know this, the nearer one leans, the more one feels the pull of small things. A single hearth can repel a cloud. A single lie can loosen a knot." He taps the staff again, and the sound carries like a bird's wing beat. Merlin closes his eyes and lets the field speak to him. He feels the tug of the faint thread like a heartbeat beneath the skin of the world. It is not a highway of inevitability, but a trail of answers left behind by those who walked before him. Hobbits' small footsteps, the steadiness of a ranger's watch, the stooping kindness of a woman who mends socks by lamplight. Each leaves a salt trail on the weave. The ring itself, he senses, has drawn many such trails like currents around a rock. To know its future, he must follow one current without drowning it. He stands then, moving as if to step forward, and for the first time since he arrived, he feels an uncertain, almost humble patience. It is a feeling that has not often visited him, the willingness to look for the smallest stitch before deciding to unpick the whole tapestry. The storm that gathered at the edge of the field grumbles, not yet striking, as if weather itself were waiting to see which way this judge will turn. Merlin adjusts his cloak and lets the rain count its small waiting notes upon the fabric. He will not call down thunder nor command an army of stars. Instead, he will walk and watch and listen for the single thin filament that might show him whether the ring will be shrouded again or whether the courage of those who held it must remain untouched. He takes his staff in hand, and the gray man steps to his side, not as a subordinate, but as a companion in keeping. They move toward the west, where the sky thins and a waning star clings to the horizon. Between them, the field exhales, the ruined earth holding its breath. Merlin's intention is a quiet thing, sharpened rather than blunted by the world's refusal to be easily unmade. He follows the slender path of consequence, each step an inquiry into whether fate here bows to power or whether it must be persuaded by the small, stubborn things that have kept the world whole. The stars were thin as silver thread, and where their light would have been whole, there was a gap as if some hand had plucked a fiber from the sky. Merlin stood with his palm half raised, the air around his fingers tasting faintly of old iron and rain. Where his magic reached, small things began to hesitate. A moth that had been beating toward a lantern hung motionless between wing beats. Smoke from a nearby hearth thinned and pooled into a pale, living glass. Gandalf watched him, gray robes like a river at winter's edge, and when he spoke, his voice was low, but carried, cutting through the quiet. "Wizard," he said, "you meddle with the weave of deeds. Every thread you touch will tug upon others unseen. Do you know what you would unmake?" Merlin's eyes were old with other winters. He answered without ceremony, and his words were not the riddles of a man who loved puzzles, but the blunt pleading of one who had seen too much death. "I have at last felt it," he said, "a single price that could be spared, a path where no ring-bearer lifts his foot upon that black road. Men and hobbits do not march to ashes. Mothers keep their sons." He lifted his hand a little further, as if to proof the possibility against his palm. "Is not such mercy worth the risk of a lost lesson?" Gandalf clenched his staff as though bracing against a storm. In the folds of his cloak, something like a shadow of the old gray pilgrim lingered, not merely the traveler, but the guardian who had learned that courage grows when there is need. "Mercy," he returned, "is not measured only in spared breath. Virtue is a flame tempered by trial. Take the iron away, and you may have comfort, but you shall not have the steel. I have seen what growth comes from the refusing of power. I will not watch it unmade for a bed of ease. They stood beneath the waning stars, two wills like different seasons meeting. Around them, the world quivered with the faint echo of Merlin's reach. It began in tender, almost comic ways. A bootlace unlooped only to knot itself anew. Moments later, A child's wooden toy rolled backward across the floor and smacked the table with a sound out of time. Then the signs grew stranger. Far off, the bell of a watchtower marked an hour twice in a row. A soldier turned from his post and found himself already where he had been, the memory of motion slipping like a fish through his fingers. Even Gandalf's beard shivered as if brushed by wind. He moved with care, a shepherd tending to goats, because he knew that once a single stitch of history unraveled, the snarl could not be smoothed by hand alone. Merlin did not flinch when the world hiccuped. He seemed to be listening to something others could not hear, a faint counterpoint beneath the pulse of events. "There is a world," he said, "that is spare of suffering, and yet—" He closed his eyes, and the soundscape altered for a breath. Where music should have been, there was a thinness, an absence that left the chest oddly hollow. He took a step toward Gandalf, and for the first time his voice carried sorrow rather than argument. Yet it is empty of song. The fiddle of a farmer child does not wake the dawn. Crow and thrush keep to themselves. People dine and rest, but they do not tell tales into the long night. Their faces are smooth as strangers. I do not know whether to call that a cure. Gandalf's reply was a whisper that nonetheless cut like frost. Songs are not trifles. They are the memory of a people and the map of its courage. To lose them is to place a calm upon the world like a lid. Uniform peace breeds the kind of men who will not know mercy because they will never have had to give it. I have seen such lands where ease made men small. What you tempt, Merlin, is not only the culling of death, but the thinning of the heart. Merlin's brow tightened. He moved then just enough to let his palm skim the edge of the falling stitch. The space between worlds opened like a rent in cloth. Through that rent there came a vision, not a full picture, but a dozen quick, painful hints that struck like the light of a lantern pass swiftly before the face. He saw a shire that lay in a deeper, softer green, its roads less scarred by footfall. He saw a table where a darkened ring was never uncoiled, where something corresponding to evil had been caught early by watchful lords and made small. The sight was as seductive as a cool spring after a desert march. There were children in that scene who had not seen the blackness of Mordor's shadow, and for a pleased breath, Merlin's features loosened. The indulgence was brief. The vision cooled, and with its retreat came echoes that were not music, but the uncanny mimicry of it. Somewhere behind them, a woman began to sing. The tune wavered and then repeated itself oddly, the last phrase trailing behind like a thought unfinished. A raven croaked and then croaked again, its second cry lacking the first's conviction. Gandalf faced Merlin, and his hands trembled only slightly, because he feared the force he had long managed might not withstand this new current. "You touch memory," he said. "When you tear out the cause, the effect can recoil. The world remembers itself in repetition. That repetition will hollow the place where song grows." Merlin's fingers tightened. He tried to explain with images a scholar might use: the pruning of a tree to encourage new limbs, a healed wound smoother than a scar. Not every lesson must cost blood, he insisted. Perhaps there are other forges. Perhaps we can guide without fire. His voice rose and fell like a tide, and in it lay a sincerity that would have swayed lesser wills. Think of the mothers. Think of the small kindnesses that never find names because their bearers were taken. Gandalf looked at him, and for a moment his face was like carved stone, warmed by a reluctant sun. And think of those small kindnesses made greater by endurance, he answered. Think of the hobbit who could have kept the ring, kept himself safe, and yet chose sacrifice so that others might live. If you unmake the need for that choice, you unmake the story that made him more than he once was. I have seen courage turn to ash when there is nothing to make it burn. His words were not empty rhetoric. Each syllable was anchored in memory of trials, of friends lost, of hard-won joy. He stepped closer to the rent. "Do not press farther, Merlin." Merlin's gaze fell briefly to his own hand. He had come because stories had weight to him. He had watched countless worlds where men bled and learned, and elsewhere he had watched children perish under suns without song. Here, in the dim, he weighed the two evils like ancient coins. The rent in time pulsed in rhythm with his thought like a wounded heart. He drew breath and then, almost imperceptibly, drew his hand back. For a heartbeat, a tentative truce. The moth resumed its wing. The lantern took back its light. The world breathed as if relieved, yet the moment of recoil bent things strange and thin. A sound from within the camp, a lute being tuned, an officer laughing, elongated into something uncanny. The laugh came again, but softer, like an echo trying to remember its origin. From beyond the trees, a line of deer trotted past and then trotted past once more, as if testing the way. Such repetitions were not harmless. They were the first small proofs that the weave would not hold unless mended by some steady hand. Gandalf's eyes darkened with a resolve that had been born of many winters. "We cannot leave this half-stitched," he said. "If it is meddled with and repaired by no mind, the world will live by echo. That is a fate not of mercy but of oubliette. Do you hear? Even now it begins to repeat itself." Merlin listened and found himself betrayed by a fear he had not meant to claim, that by saving one sorrow, he might condemn the living to a life of mimicry, to tunes that looped like a cracked bell. The choice hardened like frost. He had always loved the brightness of possibility, the way a single change could shift a mountain shadow, yet he had not before felt the scent of silence as a thing to be feared. Between them, the rent shimmered, a door not fully open and not entirely closed. Through it, the alternate world breathed faintly, perfumed by peace and muffled by absence. Gandalf stepped so close that the hem of his cloak brushed Merlin's tunic. The old gray man's voice was very soft. "If you insist," he said, "then let us be wrought together, not as rivals, but as smiths. If a stitch is to be removed, it should be replaced with surety. We must bind the consequences, shape the music, keep what is good, and let the world keep its song. But mark me, I will not help a whim that seeks only to erase. If the road we make together still hollows the heart, then I will stand against it." Merlin looked at him then with a small, rueful smile that did not reach his eyes. For all his age and certainty, a child's urgency burned in him now. "I would not ask you to betray your oath," he said, "nor would I yield mine for a lie. We will work as smiths, and if the new world needs chords, we will teach them to sing. If the world must be preserved, we will choose how it is preserved." He raised his hand once more, but this time his motion was measured, collaborative. He folded his will to the idea of partnership, as if even arrogance could be tempered by counsel. They set their hands near the rent together, fingers almost touching upon the tremulous seam. Around them, the echoes multiplied. A kettle whistled, paused, and whistled again. A young squire's step fell to ground twice, and then not at all. Time itself felt like a road marked with stones that might shift beneath the feet of any who stepped hastily. Merlin inhaled, tasting smoke, wet earth, and the faint salt of tears unshed. And then he reached further, this time accompanied by Gandalf's steadying presence. He could feel the alternative world breathing near, its silence almost a voice. He could feel also the tug of their own age, the history that would answer to their touch. Whatever men they intended was a promise and a peril both. Merlin's hand moved into the gap, and in that instant the world leaned toward decision. The echoes clustered like birds before flight, and the stars above, thin and distant, seemed to hold their breath as if to see what shape the song would take next. The spool lay coiled like a sleeping serpent beneath Merlin's palm, threads of possible time glimmering like the veins of stained glass. He drew a single fiber, and it unrolled, not with the dry whisper of paper, but with the hush of snow settling in a long valley. In the ribbon of that history, the fields of the Shire went on as before, green and small. Yet there was no quick-fire courage among its folk. A timid love of hearth replaced the glint of daring. A hobbit whose hand would have found a heavy ring and borne it to Mordor looked instead for comfort and never crossed the dangerous threshold. The song that might have been a beacon went unsung. Light blinked and died in the dark before it could gather its friends. Merlin watched, and the taste of iron rose in his mouth. He had not meant to starve the world of heroes he sought to prune cruelty, to ease a wound rather than excise a limb. But fate is not a garden wherein one may lop a bough and not feel the tree lean. Courage, he saw, is bred in the tight places, the corners of hunger and fear. Remove the heat, and the steel cools, snuff the small flames, and the great fire never takes hold. The loom of possibilities showed him consequence as plainly as shadow shows an object, sharp, immediate, inevitable. He pulled another thread. In that strand, a dark power stirred earlier than any memory spoke. It did not rise like a conquering lord upon a host. It moved at first as a searching absence, a cold that smelled of forgotten caves and rain upon stone. It listened to the world as a predator listens for the scent of one kind of meat among many. When Merlin's meddling cut the smell of suffering, the predator detected instead a new note in the air, the hand that reached into fate. That second note was unfamiliar and keen, and the hunter turned toward it with a slow and certain intelligence. The thing that noticed did not proclaim itself with banners. It uncoiled from places older than the maps of men and elves. It had the patience of stone and the appetite of winter. In some versions of its name, it was called nothing at all where names were used. They were used like bandages over wounds, temporary things, soon soiled. It learned the contours of possible worlds as one learns the scent lines of prey. Where once it took what was offered, a bright man, a careless dwarf, a hobbit unguarded, it now found a new quarry, the very hand that reached for the threads. Merlin's art made a disturbance in the weave. That disturbance was delicious. Merlin felt the attention as a pressure at the back of his head, a rasping of thought upon thought, as if an enormous animal were studying his footprints. He hardened his mind the old way, rolling up sorrows and setting them like stones under his tongue. Still, the hunter smelled him, and the hunter's curiosity sharpened into intent. It began to test the edges of possibility, nudging here and there in the spool until a bright possibility became brittle. A hobbit's foot faltered in a dream. An old man's memory of a sword faded. and Istar's direction wavered for the width of a breath. Smallnessy things, but they accumulated like frost. Far from Merlin's coil, in woods and lone stone towers, the world shifted in minor and telling ways. In Bree, a fire that should have flared long into the night guttered and went out. On a road, a woman whose song might have steadied a weary man chose silence. In the secret places where prophets and watchmen kept counsel, uneasy dreamings came, images of a hand that did not belong to any people, a hand that plucked the cords between men and fate. Gandalf felt the weather change in his bones. He named it curiosity and then worry. He did not know it was Merlin's doing, but he recognized the quality of a mind touching minds and thought, with the slow dread of one who has watched many turns that meddling calls to meddling. Merlin tried another verse of the same craft. He would not undo courage altogether. Instead, he sought to temper the sharpest edges of pain. He eased a siege, altered the path of a band of orcs, wrapped a cloak of misdirection about a sick child so that the disease passed like bad weather. Each small mercy left its mark within the spool. The farmer lived who should have died. A sword was spared. Harsh strike. Yet the hunter, tasting the new pattern, did not merely watch. It altered what it could touch. Where being spared left a wound unshaped by necessity, the hunter crept to fill the hollow. It fed on the very absence created by compassion. At a lonely ford, a rider who might have died of a barrow wound in another strand rode on to meet his doom elsewhere. In another time, a scarf of protective charm fell into the grass and was found by no hand. These were small rearrangements, but they sang the same tune to the hunter's ears. An artist had been at work upon the world. The hunter grew certain. It lifted its head and opened a mouth like a valley, and the sound that came from it was not a word, but a hunger made articulate. Merlin saw the hunter flex its awareness like a limb and understood with a clarity that chilled him that his attempt to prune had made him visible. He had intended to hide. He had intended to be a gentle shape behind the curtain, but every gentle change is a glare in some dark pocket of power. The hunter did not care for gentleness. It wanted motion and choice. It wanted the very thing Merlin had tried to suppress, because in motion there is life to feed upon. The magician's hair rose with static. He thought in syllables older than speech, in measures of consequence that required the hard logic of sacrifice. He could feel the spool pull at his fingers now quivering. Each history vibrated with a delta where the hunter's smell had passed. He realized the fossil fine truth. To prune is to redirect is to offer. A new predator came because food was offered differently. Merlin's mercy had reorganized appetite. There came then a scene of stark contrast within the spool that made him stop and breathe as if the air itself had thickened. In one hand of the world, a hobbit in a bare kitchen, small, fierce, wholly innocent, reached for an old ring because the shadow that had looked for him was not hungry enough to fashion cunning. He took the burden and, by the stubbornness of something the small folk carry in their marrow, he walked. In another hand, that hobbit lived and married and died in peace, the ring never touching his sleeve. Both ends were true in their simple ways, and both bore consequence. The hunter, Merlin saw, preferred the first, not for romance, but because it was movement and suffering and the raw, bright bone of fate. Merlin tightened his hold. He should have known by then that no spell can both save and remain unseen. Yet the temptation of a kinder world had weight to it. He told himself, as older magi had told themselves before falling to kinder lies, that small mercies might multiply. If a child here was spared, perhaps thousands more would never be bruised. But the hunter's notice had become a beam of fire. It began to circle outward from the point where Merlin's hand had touched. It catalogued alternatives with the same dispassionate hunger a hawk uses the field. The first direct touch came at a farthest thread. It was not a strike of sword or a gust of foul wind. It was subtler. It was a closing of doors. An elvish envoy, who in another strand would have learned of a plot and warned those who needed warning, missed the ship at harbor because of a sudden fog that was like the breath of a beast. A messenger whose footsteps might have carried a tidings that unmade a design, slipped into a ditch that had not been there until the hunter's attention rearranged the stones. These things could have been simple accidents, but the pattern was plain to Merlin. Someone else was moving the weave now. Gandalf reached for counsel across the miles. His words were like lantern fire sent down a long corridor. He felt and spoke and waited for reply. Merlin did not answer. He bent closer to his spool and listened to the susurrus of possible years. For all his cunning, the magician felt as if he were walking a ledge beneath a sky that had changed its rules. He had wanted to be kind. He had wished to sculpt the least cruel line of history. Instead, he had become a signpost, and the hunter came to read his sign. There came a moment when the hunter's curiosity hardened into plan. It would not challenge the great armies at once. That would be to waste its mastery. It would rather take advantage of gaps, of kindnesses, of the spots where love had softened resolve. It would push a small man here, unset a counsel there, encourage a timid hand to take a different fork. Its arithmetic was delicate and savage. 100 small, unguided mercies made a single feast. Merlin's fingers trembled not from fear, but from a cold that passes the blood. He had to choose, continue the gentle unweaving that gave comfort to a few, or withdraw and let the old cruelties keep their coarse but reliable shape. If he withdrew, many small sorrows would recur, their pain searing and honest. If he continued, he might shape smoother days and yet hand the world over to this new hunger, which would wear his marks like a cloak and learn to move through the ages like a quiet disease. He could hear as clearly as a bell the voice of a hobbit in one of the spool's strands. No high speech, only the plain, stubborn insistence that the world has a right to be faced. It was not a command. It was a presence. The choice slid between two knives, mercy with consequence, or mercy withheld for the sake of unseen danger. Merlin rose like a man who has been sitting too long and felt the ache in muscles that had not yet learned the shape of a long struggle. He rolled the spool closed and set it on the ground. Outside, the hunter's attention flicked blue through the threads and came, at last, to rest upon the place where his hand had been. For the first time, it understood the maker rather than the made. It named him with a hunger that was not a name, but a knowing, and that knowing passed through the world like a chill wind. Merlin's mouth formed a vow that was not a promise, but a plan. He would not flee from the attention he had drawn. He had not come this far to hide his work beneath a cave. He would walk into the light the hunter offered him and see whether he could outthink an appetite born of old silence. If he could not unmake the notice, then perhaps he could turn it. And if that failed, then at least he would not be the man who ran from his own hand. He stepped from the shelter of the hill where he had sat and followed the spool's final tremor into the night. The hunter felt the motion like a scent, carried on the wind, and sharpened its gaze. It began to move along the world as a shadow moves across grass, slow and inevitable, smelling the places where hands had changed things and going there to see what had been offered. As Merlin walked, the spool at his side hummed with possibilities, yet unpulled. Some threads would have to be cut clean. Some could be stitched back, if stitch there might be. He could hear, very faintly, the far-off thrum of an engine of war unmade in one strand and made twice as strong in another. He could hear, clearer still, the quiet laughter of hobbits that was yet to be learned. The hunter was coming. Merlin set his jaw and tightened his cloak, and the night seemed suddenly full of white eyes. He had chosen to meet the thing that watched him, and the world held its breath as two long minds turned to one another and measured the worth of their next moves. Beneath the waning stars, the hall lay like a thing half reclaimed by dream, its flags folded neat as petitions and its hearths gone cold in even intervals. The world Merlin had first seen, ordered, precise, stitched into a pattern of untroubled days, settled over the land now as a frost. Men and women moved in pleasant cadence. Their needs were met. Their laughter came measured like clockwork and faded on time. There was no drunken revel that ran on and broke a heart, no mercy that slowed a blade at the cost of a life. Peace, he had thought then, had a bright face. Now he felt its teeth. He stood where the loom lay coiled, a thing of woven light and iron, and watched one of its threads slip through his fingers like a sigh. Each thread had been a solution once. Each knot had been his answer to hunger, to want, to the rending of kin. He had braided safety into the very habits of men, law where law had been absent, work where there had been want, foresight where there had been ruin. It had been so simple then to believe that fewer deaths meant more good. The simplicity looked small in the face of what it had taken. When he plucked a long silver filament, somewhere a child forgot how to laugh without permission. The sound did not die so much as vanish. As if it had never been learned, the child opened his mouth and moved his lips, and the world paid no heed. Merlin felt the thread in his hand grow heavier, and with each cut an image came unbidden. A woman in a loincloth holding back a father's arm, a smith whose hands knew the secret mercy of leaving an errand undone so a neighbor might be warm. Those acts were small, and they had cost others little and meant everything. The loom had smoothed them away in exchange for a kind of certainty. The trade was not silver for gold, it was a coin that could never be used again. He did not cut blindly. He had thought to unravel the work in careful measure, drawing out the pattern that bound free will into a safer garment. He imagined, for a moment, the land remade without the heavy hand that had guided it, a world raw and honest and full of risk. But every stitch he severed was a small theft from someone who had earned softness. An old woman who had once offered bread for forgiveness found her impulse extinguished. A soldier who had once hesitated before striking regained the weight of his choice, and with it a cruelty he barely knew how to wield. Mercy had been a thing that arrived like a stray rain now. With each cut, the clouds were made to pass. Outside the hall, beyond the neat lanes of the ordered towns, the air had a new smell, metal and the slow burning of wood, and beneath them an odor less definable, the tang of enterprise stirred by a spy. The dark eye took notice. Sauron did not stride openly in those nights, but his influence moved like oil across water, finding the thinnest seams in the pattern. He would not undo the loom to let freedom sweep through the land. He would rather claim it, twist it until song and mercy became servility to his will. Merlin felt that hunger like a second shadow at his back, cold and patient, waiting to make the people's regained choices bend to a worse master. When word came, it came like a single-struck bell, riders in black cloaks on the far road, banners of a twisted hand at their poles. They did not roar, as an army should. They came in that slanted way a hawk approaches a field, quiet until the exact moment of descent. Villages that had once known the old messy liberty stirred with sudden desperate hope, and in the same hour, men who had drunk deep of ordered safety trembled lest their measured days end. Both fear and longing were fuel for the dark, and he took them both. Merlin went to one house where the loom's thread had been thin and watched a mother between two small beds. The younger child clutched a carved horse, its paint worn bright where fingers had stroked it. The elder child had been given the lesson of restraint and spoke in small, correct sentences. He could perform joy, but the raw sound had been trimmed like a hedge. When Merlin loosened a fiber, the elder child blinked, and a hemisphere of unscripted thought rose in his eyes. He reached for the horse and laughed, a sound at first startled, then thrilled. The mother's hands shook. She had known this laugh before she had known the loom. She had also known, long and painfully, the nights when her eldest would not return from the fields. A hard decision sits in a mother's chest like a stone. Merlin felt the stone and could not set it down. He learned slowly to listen to what his cuts took away. Not every severance was cruel. A chain that bound a cruel lord to his good impulses when he meant otherwise might be loosened, and townsfolk might speak again and choose mercy over strict law. But the pattern was not simply red thread and white thread. Beneath the machine's hum were hundreds of small mercies keyed to human memory and habit. Remove one and another frayed. Thread by thread, the loom's unpicking resembled not the undoing of tyranny, but the unstringing of a harp. Music, once given, was gone, and silence answered. In the distance, Sauron's shadow moved men who smelled of cold iron and boiled leather. He sent not armies at first, but bargains and lies. He proffered a map to a lord who feared the unknown, and the lord sold a tower and its watchmen to men with eyes like coals. He coaxed a captain who had never been granted rest into promising a city that could never pay him back. Small betrayals made a net. Merlin sensed this as one senses a summer storm before the thunder, the air a little denser, the shadows a tone darker. Voices reached the hall in the night, sometimes a single whisper and sometimes a choir of pleading. Free us, they said, and at the same time, hold fast. Others cried. He heard both, as one cannot hear two adversaries at once without feeling his own heart split to listen. A vintner argued that the loom had made his wine thin and his customers dim. A midwife swore the order had meant that no child died in her hands for lack of hands to help. Reason and sorrow braided into a coil that tightened around Merlin's patience. He had knitted a solution for sorrow. Now sorrow used his own needle against him. He thought of the old stories of men who had sought to make paradise through iron or stone, and how those paradises had turned to prisons. The words of the Eldar came to him not as a lecture, but as a cool wind. Freedom is a bitter draught and a sweet one. He had tasted the sweet in the softened mornings of villages now spared plagues and raids. He tasted the bitter when he saw that the price was choice itself. This was not a moral riddle left in idle talk. It was the marrow of governance set before a single man with scissors and a conscience. One night, the loom's hum changed. It had been the rhythm of ages, a deep, even pulse like a drum underwater. Now a stutter came to it, as if some external hand tugged at the weave. With the stutter rose a sound at the gate, not many feet, but one voice calling. It was not the call of merchants or minstrels. It spoke in a voice that had no echo of kindness. "Give us the pattern," it said, "or give us the man who cuts it." The voice carried the patience of iron and the guile of long hunger. Merlin recognized the cadence of Sauron's servants. He recognized how danger could be dressed as an ultimatum and how sorrow could be turned into accusation. He walked the edges of the town as dawn stained the eastern hills, and in the markets he could see what the loom had made of want. Stalls lay immaculate, herbs in neat bundles, robes folded and hung by weight. Men who once traded with the reckless joy of risk now exchanged goods with a polite economy. Trade smoothed of edges. In an alley, a pair of thieves argued with one another, their voices flat and measureless. When Merlin cut an adjacent thread, their dispute erupted into laughter, not cruel but human, and their hands reached not for knives, but for the absurdity of sharing a stolen plum. He saw the small grace of folly returned and felt it like balm. It was a brief thing the soldiers at the gate would not allow such long reprieves. Rumors came then of a host gathering east of the river, of men with helmets like black moons and horses calmer than hail. Sauron would not need to claim the loom to shape men. He needed only to wait until the peoples regained disorder, made them vulnerable. Chaos would become the wedge he used to pry open towns, and for every town pried open, the loom's unraveling would be blamed on Merlin's hand. Men forget calculation and remember only the wound. He could see it. A mob, frightened and furious, carrying torches against the stranger who promised change. There was time yet, but not enough for slow unpicking. Merlin sat by the loom as dusk fell and thought of all the faces he had seen that day. A child learning to laugh, a mother folding small clothes with a tight, frightened joy, a smith whose hand trembled as if relearning how to strike a sard with mercy. The better world he had first perceived had been clean and steady. The world he faced now was ragged but warm. He understood with a clarity that had nothing of prophecy and everything of sorrow, that to cut one more thread might buy 1,000 freedoms and also steal 1,000 mercies. A horn sounded from the valley, long and thin, like a needle through air. It was not yet the bellow of war, but it was the summons of movement. Men on the road made ready, some because they believed in the new freedom, and some because they feared what others would do with it. Merlin rose, his hand already moving toward the shears at his belt. He had learned that indecision became its own enemy. Hesitation drew the eye of the dark. He could spend his life cutting and mourning, and the hour would still come when another wielder would stand at the loom, perhaps kinder, perhaps worse. His fingers closed around the shears, and he felt the metal warm as if from a hearth. The hall's light shifted outside. Riders tightened their cloaks against a wind that tasted faintly of brimstone. He had chosen paths before and bent fates with small, grievous strokes. There remained a choice now that was heavier than the rest: to press on and impose a tidy peace that would cost the nameless mercies people had earned, or to accept the messy, dangerous freedom where laughter might be ragged and forgiveness uncertain, and yet might be truly theirs. He stepped toward the loom, and the shears rose. Just as he poised them, a shape detached itself from the gloom beyond the gate, not yet combatant, not yet emissary, but the harbinger of Sauron's design. And the hall's shadows leaned forward to listen. Beneath the waning stars he came, not as thunder, but as one who knows how to bend silence. The sky hung low and slate, the last pale fires of evening trembled like glass. Threads of something not quite light ran between hill and tower, between hearth and outlying road. Filaments that hummed with the soft insistence of fate. Where once they had guided and girded, they now quivered at his touch. Merlin moved among them like a slow hand through a net, and each fingerfall unwound a law that had held 1,000 days. The first to notice were animals, dogs that ceased to pace, horses that reared then calmed, birds that altered their course as if remembering migration anew. Men and women felt it as a subtle loosening at the base of the skull, like a tight chin strap released. Compasses wavered, lantern glass fogged without reason. A captain paused in his barking and wondered why his plan felt less like command and more like choice. That small wonder spread, an altered breath under the ribs of every living thing. Where certainty had been a cord, freedom became a raw, exposed nerve. He began to unweave, not with loud pronouncement, but with gestures old as sunrise. His staff did not strike the air instead. His fingers plucked at the filaments, and each pluck made a sound like a bell struck with downy wool. Threads slipped from their anchor points and fell like glass ribbons to the earth, where they lay cold and mute. For every strand he loosened, there rose 1,000 tiny dissonances. A river shifted a hair to the left, an embankment held when it might have failed. A boy at a crossroads chose the less trodden way. The lesson he had learned: women and men are bravest when they believe the peril is theirs alone, warred in him with old habit. He closed his eyes briefly and felt the bright ache of relinquishment like a fresh wound that would not bleed. The shadow heard the change as a void rather than a cry. It moved then, as shadows do. By swallowing contours, the air grew colder without wind, and the stars leaned further back as if reluctant to witness. It was not some single eye nor a painted sigil. It was the accumulation of the dark will that gathers behind ruined altars and in the hollows of broken trees. Where Merlin's hands had unstitched the steady lines, the shadow found loosened places to press its fingers. It came sliding beneath a ruined gate and leaned on the hinges of a village. And where courage had once been channeled by fate's sure ropes, there was now only choice, and 1,000 chances for despair. Against it, the people answered in small splendors. A farmer, sleeves rolled and lantern untrimmed, barred his gate because his neighbors had already fled, and in barring it, he bought time for the old smith to carry his son to higher ground. A woman took an axe not in obedience to any line of destiny, but because a cry made her heart fast. A young captain, whose plans had stared down a dozen sieges, tore up the map and spoke instead to a captain under him, sharing the responsibility of a falling wall. Their voices were not summoned by voice of wizard or lord. They were chosen, crude and bright, like flints struck together. There were sacrifices. The term is worn and heavy, and still it must be used. People gave themselves in quiet ways that would not fill any chronicle with glory. A teacher barred a door and let the invaders think the house empty. His breath left him under the rafters. A bridge was cut by hands that had known the warmth of home, and with the cutting came a hush of old songs that would never be sung by the cutter again. Merlin watched each small surrender as one watches a lantern gutter, an intimate light extinguished where it chose to be. He could have reached for a greater rope, for a war that would have hung armies like birds in cages. He did not. The ache of restraint lay across his shoulders like a cloak that would not fit, but he wore it. For all that, the shadow could not be wholly banished. It took what it could, claiming ruin where courage had failed to bind it. Men fell. A child's song broke when the child did not return from a watch. A banner blackened on its staff and sagged. There was no spectacle of gore, rather, there were absences like teeth removed from a row. Their mute hollows pained the living with a clarity that could not be soothed by any spell. When Merlin bent his head, the faces that passed through his mind were not trophies, but small, familiar things. A laugh at a hearthstone, a rough hand on a plow, a note hummed in a hall. He let the losses be their own. He let them remain what they were. The cost of a freedom he had chosen to restore. The change he wrought altered acts both small and large. A company of archers, freed from the knowledge of their arcs, found themselves aiming at where a shadow slackened rather than at where a string would have told them to aim. They wrought havoc by accident and by courage, an arrow loosed where choice and heart met. A commander had to trust a scout's hunch without the comfort of a prophetic thread, and the hunch proved the wiser course. Songs were composed on the fly, lines born of sweat rather than of prophecy. This new music was jagged at the edges. It held no promise of immortality, but it carried the heat of something very living. Minstrels would later teach these airs to tender ears, and those ears would find them truer because they had been bought with mortal reckoning. Memory of his right to decide began to slough from him, not instantly, but with the slow perseverance of tide. He felt it like a soft theft. The townsfolk's eyes that once widened to his approach lessened, their awe names carved into stones blurred with rain. A child who had once claimed she remembered the day Merlin crossed her field shrugged and said the story sounded like a dream. The bards who had once written his counsel into epic lines found their pens wandering to other things, harvests, storms, lovers, and left out the wizard's verdict as one omits a trivial preface. It grated and it soothed in equal measure, for to lose the keeping of others' faith is a stranger's grief and an old man's mercy both. He had chosen the fading of his own legend so that legend might not prevent a poor man from choosing what was right in a dark hour. His exile began the moment he put his palm to the last of the filaments. The touch was cool, and the sound of dozens of bells dimmed into a hush. Threads that had been bright and taut became loose cotton and sifted away on the wind. In that thinning air, the world seemed suddenly broader and also more frightening. He did not weep. Tears would have been a command, and he had chosen the absence of command. Instead, he walked away from the places he had once kept, each step a small severing. The people he had aided now turned to help each other. The old wards he had left in the walls took on a new meaning. They were no longer sovereign acts, but shared vows. The slow unmaking of his name began to ripple through tavern talk and market bartering. Within a season, his counsel would go the way of many useful things, remembered for its usefulness and then not remembered at all. When at last the shadow recoiled, if it did recoil, it did not do so beneath any single hand. The pushback was a compound of ragged bravery and blind luck. Poorly placed fires sent smoke into its throat. A wagon crushed a sally route at a narrow pass and exposed a flank that should not have been known. The shadow slipped and sought other havens. These retreats were not triumphs of fate, but of choice, and their lack of polish made them all the more picturesque. They left behind scars that would gather moss and stories that would harden into warnings and into songs. In taverns and on thresholds, the tales grew not of a sovereign that had steered them, but of ordinary fingers that had tugged at a rope and changed a single fate. He held his last small ritual alone, a thing without trumpets. The staff he had borne gave a faint, final shiver, and, with a sound like an old string breaking, let go of the last thread he had ever tied for men. He did not bury the staff. It would not have been right to keep any talisman after such a choice. Instead, he set it upon an anvil of stone and walked away as dawn stained the sky a thin pink. He felt the world's weight lighten and then shift. There was freedom, yes, a crueler, sharper freedom sat beside it. He would not be called to sit in judgment again. That knowledge held him steady, even as solitude widened around him. Still, he did not go like a man who had renounced the world entirely. He left with an intention shaped by the soft geometry of new understanding. He would wander among places where the filaments once ran, teaching a subtle art that was not enchantment, but example. He would show how to choose. When all the signs were confusing, he would teach patience and the courage to bind another's hand not with fate, but with mutual accord. That was his vow. He would not command decisions, but he would be a stubborn presence where choices hung in the balance. A silent tutor whose only magic was memory, kept alive by proximity. As he passed a ruined gate, half torn, half mended, a small figure stepped out from the shadow of a doorway and watched him. The figure was neither soldier nor lord. It was a girl, her hair knotted badly, with dirt in the seams of her dress and a look in her eye that had already been tempered by loss. She did not call his name, she did not reach, she only watched, and in her watching a kind of summons hung that Merlin had not reckoned upon. He felt it as a light tug at the back of his mind, a reminder that even absence could draw speech. He stopped, not because the road required it, but because some decisions lie in the acknowledgement of another's gaze. He inclined his head, a miniature court for no one, and then he turned toward the thinning woodlands where the tracks of old spells no longer ran true. His feet carried him toward the seam between the world he had ordered and the world he had set free. He walked with the slow dignity of a man who knows his lesson. His shoulders were weary but straight. Behind him, the village swelled with the confused music of people choosing again. Ahead, the path darkened beneath the trees, and the wind that came from that dark was neither welcoming nor hostile. It carried with it a faint sound, an old name or a new promise, he could not tell, which tugged at him as if to say that the tale was not ended, only altered. He answered that tug with a step, and the world of knotted fate and loose choice went on.